6:56 a.m., March 10, 1944. The metallic shriek of tearing aluminum screamed through Staff Sergeant Danny Kovac's ball turret as another burst of 20mm cannon fire ripped past the B-17's fuselage. His gloved hands gripped the twin .50 caliber machine gun handles with white-knuckled intensity, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Through the curved plexiglass bubble suspended beneath the bomber's belly, he counted the incoming Bf-109s. 14 of them, maybe more, dark silhouettes against the smoke-choked sky over Schweinfurt. His throat was raw from shouting into the intercom, explaining the insane thing he was about to do. The technique that had no business being attempted by any gunner who valued his life. Yet there it was, burned into his mind from 3 sleepless nights of calculations scrawled across the back of navigation charts. A firing pattern based on deflection angles no training manual had ever documented. Executed at a range so close, it violated every survival instinct the Army Air Corps had drilled into him. Through the turret's curved glass, the lead 109 grew larger with terrifying speed, its yellow nose spinner gleaming like a wasp's stinger. Kovac's finger hovered over the trigger, but still he waited. Waited while every fiber of his being screamed to open fire. The Luftwaffe pilot was closing to kill range now. 300 yards, 250, 200. Distances where German cannon shells could shred a flying fortress like paper. But Sergeant Kovac knew something his crew didn't. Something he'd discovered after watching 11 B-17s go down in flames during the February raids. The Mi-109's gun convergence pattern created a blind spot, a 3-second window where physics and geometry intersected in a way that made the impossible suddenly achievable. It was 6:56 a.m. over the burning factories of central Germany, 31 minutes into what mission planners called a maximum effort, but what the 381st Bomb Group would remember as the day one ball turret gunner rewrote the manual on defensive gunnery. Kovac's bomber, Lucky Nickel, was flying tail-end Charlie position in the low squadron, the spot where fighters always attacked first. Already, his pilot, Captain Theodore Marsh, had taken evasive action 3 times. Already, 2 other bombers in their formation were trailing smoke. His bombardier, Lieutenant Sam Weaver, had been yelling through the intercom for the last 90 seconds. "Kovac, you've got fighters at 6 o'clock level. Why the hell aren't you shooting?" But Kovac didn't respond. His entire universe had compressed to the reference markings he'd scratched into his plexiglass with a screwdriver the night before. Unauthorized modifications that would earn him a court-martial if they lived through this. Markings that divided the sky into precise geometric zones where convergence, deflection, and closing speed created kill boxes no one had properly calculated before. The lead 109 was at 150 yards now, close enough to see the pilot's head behind the armored glass. Too close for any sane gunner to still be holding fire. "Jesus Christ, Kovac!" His waist gunner, Corporal Eddie Reardon, screamed over the intercom. "Shoot! Shoot!" Kovac's jaw clenched. His training said engage at 400 yards. His instincts said the same. But his calculations, those 3 nights of obsessive mathematics, said wait. Wait until the convergence zones aligned. Wait until the 109 committed to its attack vector and couldn't break off without exposing its belly. "You're gonna get us all killed," Reardon shouted. "Watch me," Kovac replied through clenched teeth. 100 yards, 75. His thumbs pressed down on both triggers simultaneously, and the ball turret erupted in fire. December 15, 1942. Lockbourne Army Air Base, Ohio. 14 months earlier, Danny Kovac had been 3 trigger pulls away from washing out of gunnery school entirely. The frozen Ohio wind cut through his flight suit as he climbed into the training turret for his second qualification attempt. His first had been a disaster. He'd scored 42% accuracy, well below the 60% required to pass. The instructor, Master Sergeant Riley Oakes, stood with clipboard in hand, his expression suggesting he'd already written Kovac off as another statistics casualty. "Kovac, you're overthinking it," Oakes had told him after the first failure. "Point, lead the target, squeeze. It's not rocket science." But that was exactly the problem. To Danny Kovac, a former engineering student from Pittsburgh who'd enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, it absolutely was science. Physics, specifically. Ballistics, trajectories, convergence patterns, all of it governed by mathematical principles that the simplified training manual barely touched. The standard doctrine of aim where the target will be felt inadequate, imprecise. How far ahead? At what closing speed? What about vertical deflection? Wind drift? The tow plane buzzed overhead, trailing its target sleeve. Kovac settled into the turret, hands on the grips, trying to quiet the calculations racing through his mind. He'd spent the previous night in the base library, reading everything he could find on exterior ballistics and deflection shooting. His bunkmate, a farm kid from Nebraska named Chuck Henderson, had found him at 2 a.m. surrounded by books. "You know they don't expect you to actually understand it, right?" Henderson had said. "Just point and shoot like they taught us." Kovac had looked up from a physics textbook, his eyes red from exhaustion. "That's why 70% of our rounds miss. We're guessing instead of calculating." Now, with Sergeant Oakes watching and his military career hanging in the balance, Kovac made a decision. He stopped trying to follow the doctrine and started following the math. He estimated the tow plane's speed at 180 miles per hour. Distance approximately 300 yards. Convergence point of the twin 50s at 250 yards. Wind from the northwest at roughly 15 knots. He waited for the geometry to align in his mind, then fired. The first burst missed, but the second found its mark. So did the third, fourth, and fifth. By the end of the exercise, Kovac had scored 81%, one of the highest marks in his class. Sergeant Oakes stared at the results, then at Kovac. "What the hell did you do differently?" Oakes demanded. "I did the math, Sergeant," Kovac replied quietly. That should have been the end of it. Kovac passed, got his gunner wings, and was assigned to a B-17 crew. But the question Oakes had asked stuck with him through training, through the Atlantic crossing, through his first 5 missions. What did you do differently? The answer, Kovac was beginning to realize, wasn't just about passing a test. It was about something larger, a fundamental gap between how gunners were trained to fight and how the physics of aerial combat actually worked. That realization would either save his life or end it. He just didn't know which yet. February 21, 1944. 381st Bomb Group, Ridgewell, England. The mission to Stuttgart had cost the 381st 11 bombers. Danny Kovac had watched 3 of them disintegrate within visual range, including the Memphis Queen, piloted by his best friend from training, Lieutenant Marcus Webb. The image was seared into his memory. The 109 closing from 6 o'clock high. The ball turret gunner opening fire at 400 yards exactly as trained. The tracers streaming past the fighter as it jinked left. Then the devastating return fire that turned the bomber's wing into a fireball. The gunner had done everything right according to doctrine, and he died for it. Back in the crew hut that night, while others tried to drink away the images, Kovac sat at the small table with borrowed books from the base intelligence officer and began to diagram what he'd seen. He sketched the attack geometry from memory, the fighter's approach angle, the bomber's defensive fire, the predictable evasion patterns. Around him, the other crew members of Lucky Nickel tried to decompress in their own ways. "You gonna join the living, Danny?" Eddie Reardon asked, gesturing with a bottle toward the impromptu wake happening in the corner. "Or keep playing math teacher?" "Marcus Webb is dead because our gunnery doctrine is wrong," Kovac said quietly, not looking up from his sketches. The hut went silent. Captain Marsh, their pilot, set down his drink and walked over. "That's a hell of a thing to say, Sergeant." Kovac finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "Sir, request permission to speak freely." "Granted. The Luftwaffe has been fighting this war for 5 years. We've been at it for 2. They've learned our doctrine because it never changes. Engage at 400 yards, maximum deflection, pray something connects. They compensate for it. Every fighter pilot knows he'll face defensive fire at 400 yards, so they're ready to evade. We might as well send them a telegram announcing when we're going to shoot." Lieutenant Weaver leaned forward. "So what are you suggesting? We let them get closer? That's suicide." "No," Kovac said, spreading out his diagrams. "It's geometry. Look, when a 109 attacks from 6 o'clock, he's committed to a pursuit curve. His guns are harmonized to converge at 200 yards because that's where he expects to open fire. Between 400 and 200 yards, he's still maneuverable, anticipating our fire. But there's a window, right here, between 100 and 75 yards, where he's already committed to his attack vector. If he breaks off that close, he loses his firing solution and has to pull away to avoid collision. He can't evade and maintain his attack. That's the kill box." "You're talking about letting them get to 75 yards, Marsh said slowly. "Point-blank range. I'm talking about hitting what we shoot at instead of wasting ammunition on suppressive fire that doesn't suppress anything." Eddie whistled low. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And I once watched a guy try to fight a bear in Alaska." But Kovac was already running calculations, his pencil scratching across paper. Closing speed of 450 miles per hour combined. Time to collision from 100 yards, 0.68 seconds. Time to fire effective burst, 0.4 seconds. Margin for error, 0.28 seconds. He looked up at his crew. "It works. Mathematically, it works. The question is whether we've got the nerve to prove it." The crew exchanged glances. Finally, Captain Marsh spoke. "You're asking us to trust you with our lives based on some sketches and arithmetic." "No, sir," Kovac replied. "I'm asking you to trust physics. I'm just the guy who did the math." March 9, 1944. 2300 hours. The screwdriver made a sharp scratching sound against the plexiglass as Danny Kovac carefully etched another reference line into his ball turret's curved surface. It was 11 p.m., and the hardstand was freezing, but he worked with methodical precision, checking and rechecking his calculations by flashlight. Each mark represented a specific deflection angle, a geometric reference point for the firing solution he'd spent 2 weeks perfecting. "You know they can court-martial you for defacing military equipment," a voice said from behind him. Kovac didn't turn around. He recognized Captain Marsh's voice. "Yes, sir, I'm aware." Marsh climbed up onto the Lucky Nickel's wing and peered at the modifications. "Those marks going to make a difference tomorrow? They'll help me acquire targets faster in the kill box. Eliminate guesswork." Kovac paused his work. "Sir, permission to speak candidly? When have I ever stopped you? The target list for tomorrow's mission, Schweinfurt, the ball-bearing plants, intelligence says they'll throw everything they have at us. If I'm right about this technique, we'll need it. If I'm wrong—" He let the sentence hang. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I talked to Colonel Morrison about your theory. Showed him your diagrams." Kovac's heart sank. "Sir, I asked you not to." He said it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard, and that if you tried it, he'd ground you permanently. Marsh paused. "He also said that of the 11 crews we lost at Stuttgart, 10 of them followed doctrine perfectly and died anyway. The one that survived had a gunner who held his fire until the last second because his guns had jammed. The fighter broke off the attack rather than risk collision." Kovac looked up sharply. "He broke off? Exactly what your theory predicted. The fighter pilot wasn't willing to play chicken at 75 yards. Marsh met his eyes. "I'm not ordering you to use your technique tomorrow. I can't, but I'm not stopping you either." The crew took a vote. "We're with you." "Even Eddie?" Marsh laughed. Eddie said, and I quote, "If I'm gonna die, might as well be doing something interesting instead of the same old useless shooting." After Marsh left, Kovac finished his modifications and climbed into the turret for a systems check. The familiar cramped space felt different now, transformed from a defensive position into a precision instrument. He practiced traversing the turret, aligning his scratched reference marks with imaginary targets, timing his trigger response. The twin 50-caliber machine guns had roughly 500 rounds each. At his calculated rate of fire, in short, precise bursts rather than sustained streams, he had enough ammunition for approximately 12 engagements. 12 chances to prove his theory, or 12 chances to get his crew killed. At midnight, Lieutenant Weaver found him still in the turret, running through mental rehearsals. "Danny, you need sleep. Long mission tomorrow." "Can't sleep," Kovac admitted. "Keep running the numbers." "And?" "They work, Sam. Every scenario, every approach angle. The math works. It's just—" he trailed off. "It's just that math doesn't account for the human element," Weaver finished. "The fear when you're watching a fighter come at you with guns blazing and every instinct screams to shoot now instead of waiting." "Yeah?" Weaver was quiet for a moment. "You know what separates a good bombardier from a dead one? The ability to ignore your instincts and trust your instruments during the bomb run. Flak exploding all around, fighter attacks, aircraft shaking apart, and I'm staring at the Norden sight making tiny adjustments because the mathematics of the bombing solution don't care about fear. Maybe ball turret gunnery isn't so different." After Weaver left, Kovac pulled out his notebook and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of his calculations. "Trust the math. The math doesn't lie." He would need to remember that in approximately 8 hours. 6:54 a.m., March 10, 1944, the radio crackled with the group leader's warning. "Fighters, 11 o'clock high, coming down." Danny Kovac rotated his ball turret, scanning the sky through his scratched-up plexiglas. The Bf-109s appeared as dark specks against the pre-dawn clouds. But he'd seen this formation before. A classic Luftwaffe assault pattern designed to hit the low squadron first, knock out the vulnerable tail-end bombers, then work forward through the formation. Lucky Nickel was exactly where the Germans would strike first. "I count 14, Kovac reported into the intercom, his voice steadier than he felt. "They're setting up for a 6 o'clock attack run." "Acknowledged," Captain Marsh replied. "All gunners, weapons free." "Kovac, your call." His call. 2 words that meant Marsh was trusting him completely. Trusting the math. Trusting 3 weeks of obsessive calculations and 1 night of unauthorized turret modifications. Eddie Reardon's voice came through. "Hey, Danny, those fighters are going to be here in about 60 seconds, just so you know." "I know," Kovac replied, tracking the lead 109 as it rolled into its attack dive. His thumbs rested on the triggers, but he kept them still. The fighter was at 800 yards now, building speed in its dive. Standard doctrine said wait until 400, then open fire. His modified doctrine said something very different. 600 yards. The other gunners in the formation started firing, creating a cone of tracers. The attacking fighters dove through. The lead 109 jinked right, evading the defensive fire exactly as Kovac had predicted. These pilots had done this 100 times. They knew the defensive patterns, knew when to expect fire, knew how to evade. 400 yards. This was where Kovac was supposed to shoot. His finger tightened on the trigger involuntarily. Muscle memory from training trying to override his conscious plan. Through his reference marks, he tracked the fighter's approach angle, calculating deflection in real time. "Danny?" Eddie's voice held a note of panic. 300 yards. The 109's cowl-mounted machine gun sparked to life. Bright flashes in the gray morning. Tracers streaked past the turret, so close Kovac could see them zip by individual rivets on the fuselage above him. The bomber shuddered as rounds impacted the tail section. "Kovac, shoot!" Lieutenant Weaver yelled. 200 yards. The fighter filled his entire field of vision now. He could see the pilot's leather helmet, the yellow spinner, individual panel lines on the aircraft's fuselage. His mind screamed at him to fire, to do something, anything. But the math said wait. The geometry wasn't right yet. 150 yards. The 109's 20mm cannons opened up, heavier weapons that could tear the bomber apart. An explosion rocked the aircraft. Something had been hit. Smoke streamed past the turret. Still, Kovac waited, his entire world reduced to those scratched reference marks and the fighter sliding into position. 100 yards. This was it. The kill box. The fighter was committed now, locked into its attack vector. At this range and closing speed, the pilot couldn't evade without breaking off entirely and pulling up to avoid collision. For the next 0.68 seconds, the 109 would fly a completely predictable path. Kovac's thumbs came down on both triggers. The twin .50 calibers erupted, and Kovac walked his fire directly into the fighter's path. Not where it was, where physics demanded it had to be. The convergence was perfect. He saw the strikes walking up the 109's cowling, across the canopy, into the engine. Smoke instantly poured from the fighter. It rolled left, broke off its attack, and began trailing fire. "Holy shit!" Eddie breathed over the intercom. "Holy shit! You got him!" But Kovac was already traversing the turret. The second 109 was at 250 yards and closing. 6:56 a.m., March 10th, 1944, the second. Second Bf 109 pilot had seen his wingman go down, but he was already committed to his attack run. Danny Kovac tracked him through the reference marks, his mind working through calculations with mechanical precision. This fighter was approaching from 7 o'clock low, a slightly different angle. Adjust deflection. Compensate for closure rate. Wait for the kill box. The bomber's waist gunner opened fire at 350 yards, standard doctrine. The tracers streamed past the 109 harmlessly as the pilot jinked upward, exactly as Kovac had predicted. These pilots were good, experienced, confident in their ability to evade the predictable American defensive fire. 125 yards. The 109 steadied for its firing pass. 100 yards. Kill box. Kovac fired a 3-second burst. The .50 caliber rounds converged precisely where the geometry dictated the fighter had to be. He saw strikes on the wing root, then the canopy shattered. The 109 snap-rolled right and plummeted. "Two," Kovac muttered, already searching for the next target. What happened over the next 4 minutes would be analyzed by Army Air Corps intelligence officers for months afterward. The Luftwaffe had committed 14 Bf 109s to the attack on the 381st's low squadron, expecting to down 3 or 4 bombers using their standard tactics. What they encountered instead was something none of them had trained for, a ball turret gunner who didn't shoot when they expected, who waited with inhuman patience until physics removed all their options. The third fighter came in at 6 o'clock high. Kovac let him close to 90 yards before firing. The 109 exploded. "Three!" Eddie was shouting now, abandoning his own position to watch. "Danny, they're not breaking off." "They don't understand why they're dying," Kovac replied, his voice distant, clinical. "They think it's luck." Fighter number 4 learned differently. This pilot was more cautious, approaching from 8 o'clock level. He saw the wrecks of his comrades and adjusted his tactics, opening fire at 200 yards and preparing to break off early. But Kovac had calculated this scenario too. He fired at 110 yards, the outer edge of his kill box, and stitched rounds through the 109's engine. The fighter veered away, trailing coolant and oil. Crew compartment filling with smoke. One of the waist gunners finished it off. 4, Kovac counted. The 5th and 6th fighters attacked simultaneously from different angles. A coordinated assault meant to split the gunner's attention. But Kovac's modified turret traverse allowed him to snap between targets faster than standard doctrine recommended. He caught the first 109 at 85 yards, a perfect deflection shot that severed its tail section. The second fighter, seeing his wingman disintegrate, pulled up hard to abort his attack, but not before Kovac's rounds punched through his belly armor. The 109 rolled inverted and fell away. 6, Kovac said. His voice was mechanical now, all emotion burned away by pure focus. Reloading. Danny, Captain Marsh's voice cut through, tight with stress. We've got smoke from number 3 engine. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You're the only thing keeping us alive. Fighters 7 and 8 came in together, having learned from the others' mistakes. They stayed at 150 yards, outside what they assumed was his effective range, and poured fire into the bomber. The Lucky Nickel shuddered under the impacts. Somewhere above Kovac, someone screamed. But the fighters had miscalculated. They were outside the standard gunnery range, but Kovac's kill box extended further than they expected when he compensated for their closure rate. He took the deflection shot on Fighter 7 at 140 yards, a longer solution, more risk of missing, and saw strikes on the wing. The 109 sheared off, wing folding. Fighter 8 pressed the attack, committed now. Kovac waited. 100 yards. The pilot's face was visible, eyes wide behind his goggles. Had he recognized what was happening? That he'd flown into a geometry trap? 75 yards. Kovac fired. The 109 came apart. 8, he announced. His ammunition counter showed he was down to 30%. Had to make every burst count now. The remaining 6 fighters, veterans who'd suddenly realized they were facing something unprecedented, changed tactics entirely. They began making high-speed slashing attacks, firing and breaking away before entering the kill box. But Kovac had calculated this scenario too. He led them more, adjusted for their faster closure rate, and caught Fighter 9 with a deflection shot at 200 yards that shredded its cooling system. Fighter 10 tried a head-on attack, coming straight up from below. Kovac rotated the turret to its maximum downward angle and fired at 95 yards. The 109 flew directly into the stream of 50 caliber rounds and disintegrated. 10, Kovac said. His voice was hoarse now. Fighters 11 and 12 came in together for a final coordinated assault, both from 6 o'clock but at different altitudes. They were firing from 300 yards, accepting reduced accuracy to stay out of the kill box. The bomber shook under the impact of cannon shells. Kovac made a split-second decision. Take the higher fighter first, the one with the better angle. He caught number 11 at 105 yards as it adjusted altitude. The fighter's cockpit became a cloud of debris. Number 12, seeing his wingman die, broke off his attack and pulled up hard. But he'd forgotten about Eddie Reardon at the waist gun position. Eddie, who'd been watching Kovac's technique and learned. The waist gunner held his fire until the fighter reached 100 yards in its climbing turn, then fired a sustained burst into the 109's belly. The fighter staggered, rolled, and began its final descent. 12, Eddie said, his voice filled with awe. 12 confirmed kills in 4 minutes. The remaining 2 109s broke off the attack entirely and dove away. The Luftwaffe had lost 12 fighters to 1 bomber's defensive fire. It was unprecedented. It was impossible. It had just happened. Kovac slumped in his turret, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Through the intercom, he could hear his crew's voices overlapping. Damage reports, casualty checks, stunned exclamations. The right waist gunner, Corporal Jim Peterson, had taken shrapnel, but was alive. Number 3 engine was out. The tail was shredded, but they were flying. "Danny," Captain Marsh said quietly, "I don't know what the hell I just witnessed, but you saved this crew. You understand that?" Kovac didn't respond. He was staring at his scratched reference marks, at the empty shell casings floating around his turret, at his trembling hands. The math had worked. Physics didn't care about fear or doctrine or conventional wisdom. The math had worked. But 12 men were dead because of his calculations. 12 enemy pilots who'd been following their own training, their own tactics. He'd turned aerial combat into a geometry problem and solved it with ruthless efficiency. He wasn't sure how he felt about that yet. 14:30 hours, March 10th, 1944. 381st Bomb Group Headquarters. The intelligence officer, Captain Walter Bryce, stared at Danny Kovac like he was examining an alien artifact. Around the debriefing room, a crowd had gathered, unusual for a routine mission debrief. Colonel Morrison stood in the corner, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The crew of Lucky Nickel sat exhausted in their chairs, except for Jim Peterson, who was in the base hospital getting shrapnel removed from his shoulder. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," Bryce said slowly, checking his notes. "You're claiming 12 confirmed fighter kills from the ball turret position?" 11 confirmed from my position," Kovac replied quietly. "Eddie got number 12. Bryce looked at Eddie Reardon. "Using Sergeant Kovac's technique?" "Yes, sir. I watched him do it 11 times, and figured if I was gonna die anyway, might as well die trying something that actually worked." Bryce turned to Captain Marsh. "And you authorized this technique?" Marsh chose his words carefully. "I authorized Sergeant Kovac to defend this aircraft using his best judgment, which is what any pilot would tell any gunner. By holding fire until German fighters reached point-blank range? By waiting until he could actually hit what he was shooting at, instead of wasting ammunition on suppressive fire that doesn't suppress anything." The room went silent. Colonel Morrison pushed off from the wall and walked to the front. "Sergeant Kovac, stand up!" Kovac stood, bracing for the court-martial he knew was coming. He'd defaced military equipment, violated gunnery doctrine, and endangered his crew by implementing unauthorized tactics. "You scratched unauthorized reference marks into your turret's plexiglas," Morrison said. "Yes, sir." "You developed a firing solution that contradicts every manual we have?" "Yes, sir." "You held your fire while under attack, allowing enemy fighters to close to suicidal range before engaging?" "Yes, sir." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "Captain Bryce, do we have gun camera footage?" "Yes, sir. I've reviewed it 3 times. I've never seen anything like it. The deflection shooting is textbook perfect, except there is no textbook for what he did." "Show it?" The lights dimmed and the projector clicked on. The grainy black and white footage showed the view from Lucky Nickel's cameras, synchronized with Kovac's firing times. The room watched in silence as fighter after fighter entered the frame at impossibly close range and then disintegrated under Kovac's fire. The precision was unmistakable. These weren't lucky shots. Each burst hit exactly where it needed to. When the lights came back up, Morrison turned to the room. "How many crews did we lose today?" "2, sir," Bryce replied, "plus 4 more heavily damaged. Total casualties, 18 dead, 23 wounded. And of the 5 bombers in Kovac's immediate formation, Lucky Nickel was the only one that didn't take casualties, sir. The fighters concentrated their attack on that position because it's standard doctrine. Hit the tail end, Charlie first. But after losing 12 aircraft to 1 bomber, the remaining fighters broke off the attack on that entire formation." Morrison looked at Kovac. "Your unauthorized modifications and unorthodox tactics saved not just your crew, but likely the 4 other bombers in your formation. Possibly more, The Luftwaffe pulled back their entire fighter group after losing 12 aircraft in 4 minutes. That's not tactical withdrawal. That's shock. Kovac didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent. It's also, Morrison continued, a complete violation of protocol and military procedure. You should be court-martialed. He paused. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm grounding you. Kovac's heart sank. You're grounded from combat operations effective immediately because I'm transferring you to the gunnery school at Lavenham. As an instructor, you're going to teach every ball turret and waist gunner in this theater your technique. Captain Bryce, you're going to document everything Sergeant Kovac did. Every calculation, every reference mark, every decision point. I want a manual on my desk in 2 weeks. The room erupted in murmurs. Bryce looked stunned. Sir, we're talking about completely rewriting defensive gunnery doctrine. No, Morrison corrected. We're talking about replacing defensive gunnery doctrine that gets our men killed with one that actually works. Sergeant Kovac proved that today. He turned back to Kovac. You have any problem with that, Sergeant? No, sir, Kovac managed. Good. Because if your technique can be taught, if we can get even half our gunners performing at your level, we could cut our bomber losses by 20, maybe 30%. That's hundreds of crew lives saved. Morrison's expression softened slightly. You did something extraordinary today, Sergeant. Not just the shooting. Any gunner with enough ammunition and luck might down a few fighters. But you thought differently. You saw a problem everyone accepted as unsolvable, and you solved it with math and courage. That's worth more than any medal. After the debrief, Eddie found Kovac outside the headquarters building, staring at the distant hardstands where ground crews were patching up the returning bombers. You okay? Eddie asked. I killed 12 men today, Kovac said quietly. You saved 43, Eddie countered. The crews in our formation who made it home because those fighters broke off. That's what you should remember. But Kovac was thinking about something else. What if it doesn't work for other gunners? What if I'm the only one who can make the math work under pressure? Eddie lit a cigarette and offered one to Kovac, who declined. Then we'll find out. But I watched you do it, and I got one myself using your technique. So it's not just you. And anyway, even if only half the gunners can pull it off, that's better than what we had before. Later that night, Kovac sat in the crew hut with his notebook, beginning the process of documenting everything, every calculation, every decision tree, every geometric principle. It was one thing to do something in combat when adrenaline and necessity compressed time. It was another to break it down into teachable steps. But if it could save even one crew, he had to try. April 18, 1944, Army Air Corps, Gunnery School, Lavenham. 6 weeks after Schweinfurt, Danny Kovac stood before a classroom of 32 ball turret and waist gunners, holding a piece of chalk and facing the most skeptical audience he'd ever encountered. These were combat veterans, men who'd survived multiple missions using the standard doctrine. Telling them to abandon that doctrine in favor of a technique that looked like suicide wasn't going well. You're out of your mind, said a staff sergeant from the 303rd Bomb Group. Let a 109 get to 75 yards? That's how you die. Kovac drew a diagram on the chalkboard. Fighter approach angle, convergence zones, the kill box geometry. That's how you die using standard doctrine. At 400 yards, you're firing at where you hope the fighter will be. The pilot knows this and evades. At 75 yards, physics removes his options. Physics doesn't stop cannon shells from ripping through your aircraft, another gunner countered. No, Kovac agreed, but accuracy does. Standard doctrine means you're trading shot for shot with the fighter, hoping you get lucky before he does. My technique means you fire fewer rounds with higher precision at a moment when he cannot evade. You're not in a gunfight. You're executing a geometric proof that ends with the fighter dead. The resistance was understandable. Kovac was asking combat veterans to override their survival instincts and training. The breakthrough came when Captain Bryce showed the gun camera footage from Schweinfurt. The room watched in silence as fighter after fighter died with mechanical precision. "How many rounds did you expend?" one of the gunners asked quietly. Kovac checked his notes. 487 rounds total for 11 kills, roughly 44 rounds per kill. The room murmured. Standard doctrine averaged over 2,000 rounds per kill, if they got a kill at all. You're telling me you achieved a better than 90% hit rate? In the kill box, yes. Because the physics removes uncertainty. Kovac pointed to his diagram. Outside the kill box, I'm no more accurate than anyone else. But inside it, if you calculate correctly and fire at the right moment, hitting the target isn't luck. It's inevitable. The training program ran for 6 weeks. Of the 32 gunners in the first class, 18 managed to successfully implement the technique in training scenarios. 14 couldn't override their instincts to hold fire long enough. That 56% success rate was simultaneously disappointing and revolutionary. Even 18 gunners using the technique effectively would mean dozens of fighters downed that would otherwise have continued attacking. The second class had a better success rate, 21 out of 30. Word was spreading through the bomber groups, and gunners were volunteering for the training. By June 1944, over 200 gunners had been trained in what the Army Air Corps officially designated as calculated deflection gunnery, but what the crews called Kovac's crazy math. The impact on bomber operations was measurable. Bomb groups with trained gunners reported a 23% reduction in fighter-related casualties and a 38% increase in confirmed fighter kills from defensive fire. The Luftwaffe began changing tactics in response, becoming more cautious in their approaches, breaking off attacks earlier. That caution, even when facing untrained gunners, saved additional lives. But implementation wasn't without problems. In May, a gunner from the 91st Bomb Group held his fire too long while calculating his solution and was killed before he could engage. In June, another gunner misjudged his deflection at close range and accidentally hit a friendly fighter that had strayed too close to the formation. The technique demanded precision and judgment that not every gunner possessed. Colonel Morrison called Kovac into his office after the friendly fire incident. "Some people are saying your technique is too dangerous, too difficult to execute under combat stress." Kovac had thought about this extensively. "Sir, standard doctrine has a 100% failure rate against experienced Luftwaffe pilots. My technique has a 56 to 60% success rate among trained gunners. Even accounting for the risks, the math favors implementation." Morrison nodded slowly. "I agree, but we need to be selective about who we train. Not every gunner has the temperament for it." By August 1944, the 8th Air Force had integrated calculated deflection gunnery into official doctrine, not as a replacement for standard gunnery, but as an advanced technique for qualified gunners. Kovac was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned permanently to the training command. He would never fly another combat mission. Some might have seen that as a disappointment, but Kovac knew the math. In his 23 combat missions, he'd saved 1 bomber crew, his own. In 6 months of training, he'd taught the technique to over 400 gunners, who collectively would down an estimated 800-plus fighters and save dozens of bomber crews. The impact calculation was simple. Teaching was worth more than fighting. October 15, 1988, Air Force Museum, Wright-Patterson, AFB, Ohio. Danny Kovac, now 73 years old and walking with a cane, stood before a display case containing his old ball turret gun sight, with the scratched reference marks still visible in the plexiglass. Beside it, a placard read, "Calculated Deflection Gunnery System, developed by Sergeant Danny Kovac, 381st Bomb Group, 1944. This technique revolutionized defensive aerial gunnery and is credited with saving an estimated 2,000-plus aircrew lives during wwii II. A young Air Force captain approached him. "Mr. Kovac, I'm Captain Sarah Chen. I wrote my thesis at the Academy on the evolution of defensive aerial tactics. Your technique was a major part of it." Kovac smiled. "They still teach it?" "The principles, yes. Obviously, the specific application has changed with technology. But the core concept, using physics and geometry to create high-probability engagement zones, that's fundamental to modern aerial combat doctrine." She gestured to the display. "What you did was apply engineering precision to a problem everyone else was solving with volume of fire and hope." "It was just math," Kovac said quietly. "It was courage," Chen countered. "Math on paper is one thing. Holding your fire while a fighter is shooting at you because the calculation says wait another 0.3 seconds? That's something else entirely." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the scratched plexiglass that had once been the difference between life and death at 30,000 feet. "Can I ask you something?" Chen said. "In the moment, when you were waiting for the fighters to reach the kill box, what were you thinking?" Kovac considered the question. He'd been asked it hundreds of times over the years, at reunions and interviews and ceremonies. Usually, he gave the simple answer, "I was thinking about the math." But something about this young officer's genuine curiosity made him want to be more honest. "I was terrified," he admitted. "Every instinct I had was screaming to shoot immediately. But I'd watched my best friend die because conventional tactics didn't work. I'd done the calculations and knew there was a better way. But knowing something intellectually and trusting it with your life are different things." He paused. "That first shot at Schweinfurt, when I held fire until 75 yards, I wasn't sure I'd done the math right. I thought there was a real chance I just killed myself and my entire crew because I was too stubborn to follow doctrine. But you took the shot anyway, because being wrong's my way gave us a chance. Being right the conventional way still got us killed." Kovac pointed to the display. "That's what people don't understand about innovation. It's not about being fearless. It's about being more afraid of accepting an unacceptable outcome than you are of trying something new." Chen pulled out a notebook. "Would you mind if I quoted that?" They talked for another hour. Kovac told her about the gunners he'd trained, many of whom he'd stayed in contact with over the decades. He told her about Eddie Reardon, who'd survived the war and become a math teacher, always telling his students about the time calculations saved his life. About Captain Marsh, who'd made general and never stopped crediting Kovac's technique with his survival. About the dozens of crews who'd written to him over the years, thanking him for training their gunners. But he also told her about the failures, the gunners who'd tried the technique and mistimed it, the friendly fire incident, the psychological burden of calculating human death with mathematical precision. "Innovation in war saves lives," he said, "but it also takes them. You can't forget that part." As the museum was closing, Chen walked Kovac to his car. "One more question," she said. "If you could go back to that night before Schweinfurt, knowing everything you know now, would you still scratch those reference marks into your turret?" Kovac didn't hesitate. "Yes, because 2,000 men came home to their families who wouldn't have otherwise. Because warfare is about problem solving, and I'd solved a problem. Because sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is trust your calculations when everyone else trusts tradition." He opened his car door, then paused. "But I'd also make sure the young gunners I trained understood that math is a tool, not a replacement for judgment. Some of them treated it like a magic formula instead of a framework for decision-making. That's on me." Driving home, Kovac thought about the display in the museum, his name on the placard, the legacy of those 4 minutes over Schweinfurt. But what he remembered most clearly wasn't the moment of triumph, or the kills, or even the recognition. It was the quiet hour after the debrief, sitting in the crew hut with his notebook, trying to figure out how to teach others what he'd learned. Because that's what innovation really was, not the flash of insight or the dramatic proof of concept, but the patient work of turning a successful experiment into reproducible methodology. 12 fighters destroyed in 4 minutes had been extraordinary, teaching 400 gunners to think differently about their craft. That had been important. The math had been right. But more than that, the math had been shareable. And in war, as in most of human endeavor, knowledge that could be taught was worth more than skill that couldn't. That was the real legacy of those scratched reference marks. Not that one gunner had found a better way, but that he'd cared enough to show others the path. Author's note: while this story is fictionalized, it represents the broader reality of innovation in wartime. Countless soldiers, sailors, and airmen developed field modifications and tactical innovations that saved lives and changed doctrine. Their courage wasn't just in facing the enemy, but in daring to question accepted wisdom when lives hung in the balance. The mathematics of courage is simple. Sometimes the most radical act is thinking differently when everyone else follows tradition.